Hello everyone, welcome to 21st Century Warm-Ups Improvisational Exercises for Orchestras and Individuals. My name is Taylor Morris. I am a violinist, fiddler, and educator based in Mesa, Arizona. I have a private studio. I do a lot of teaching at camps and summer workshops and things like that. But my main project during the school year is that I am a co-founder and co-director of the Gilbert Fiddlers, which is an extracurricular high school fiddle group based outside Gilbert, Arizona. To our knowledge, the Gilbert Fiddlers are the only high school fiddle group in the country whose students themselves create all of their own arrangements for performances. Before I tell you a little bit more about what we're going to be getting into today, this is going to be an interactive session. So if you do not have your instrument out and handy, I would suggest that you go grab it now while I give you some background. All of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you today have grown out of my experiences of coming to improvisation as someone who had already gone through music school, who had a full rigorous classical training, but is finding themselves in situations where I need to know how to improvise. And a lot of the work that I've done and my own growth has actually been facilitated through my teaching, which is one of the amazing things about teaching improvising, is that you can teach it to your students. And when you work on improvising with your students, you are also improvising. So you are getting to practice improvising alongside them. One of the reasons that I'm so passionate about exploring improvisation and finding ways to explore it with students, and the subject of today's session about using improvisation as a warm-up exercise, is that I have often found that students' experience of scales is that the point of scales is to play more scales. And they don't really see the bigger picture, which is a bummer because we know as teachers that the thing with scales is that they are such a useful tool for our growth. Not only do they teach us how to play in tune, but we can also practice any technical or musical skill through scales. And so we know that, but for our students, they're often practicing scales because their private teacher is making them, or they have to know them for a chair test, or they need them for a youth symphony audition. And so for students, scales become divorced from music making. And it's just like a thing that you have to do that doesn't have any bigger meaning. And so for me, something that I have found that's been really beneficial for my students in their scales is using improvisation to bring these two things together. Because scales, as we know, are building blocks for music. Composers use scales, composers think in scales, musicians think in scales, this is a thing. But for students, they don't always see that connection. And so even though we understand that we're having you practice in D major because your piece is in D major, practicing a scale doesn't feel like playing music. So we can use improvisation as a tool to help students forge connections in their musical understanding to see how practicing scales and thinking in key signatures relates to what they spend most of their time doing when they're actually playing music and working on music. I'm going to lead you through 5 different improvisation exercises or activities that I use with my students to develop their improvisational comfort. They are all rooted in very basic understandings of scales and exploration of scales. So we'll have 5 different exercises for pairs or group settings. 2 of those exercises you can use individually, and I hope that you will incorporate them into your own practice as you explore improvising and explore improvising with your students. And my hope is that you incorporate these into your teaching and playing, but let me say that I do not intend these exercises to be a replacement for scales. It's very important for our students to work on scales in the traditional way of just going up and then going down and practicing with a metronome and those types of things. That's a super, super important thing. But I hope that these exercises will give you some other ways that you can help students bring their scale work and tie it to their music that they're playing and bridge that gap so that they can see the bigger picture that we all know is there. The first activity we're going to explore is less of a defined exercise and more of a concept that we need to be able to understand to approach any improvisation. So we're going to talk about the concept and we'll work through some ways that you can explore it, but ultimately you will need to create the structure of this for your students when you're taking them through this idea. So we're going to be talking about improvising or soloing in a key signature. Up front, we need to understand that improvisation is freedom within constraints. And what we are practicing is the ability to make choices in real time within those constraints. Importantly, we need to understand that technical ability on an instrument and creative ability on an instrument are not the same thing. And often we conflate those as music educators, but they're not the same. Let me explain what I mean. When I started fiddling, I would watch these videos or listen to these recordings of really incredible fiddlers who are improvising solos. And I would think to myself, I could do that. They're not even leaving first position or whatever the thing might be. And I could do it if I had transcribed it and notated it and practiced it. But me having the technical ability to play a solo that someone else made up on the spot, and me being able to make up a comparable solo on the spot, are very different things. So it will save you a lot of angst and frustration if, especially when you're working with more advanced students, if you understand this concept and you come to help them understand this concept, if you find that this is a block for them as they're exploring improvisation. A really helpful metaphor that I have found that you can adjust for different age levels is that exploring improvisation is a bit like growing up. So when you're a kid, your parents don't let you leave the house by yourself. And then maybe when you're a little bit older, you can go over to the neighbor's house and you can play with the neighbor kids. And then maybe one day you get a bike and your parents let you go on your bike, but you're only allowed to go around the block and no further. Fast forward, maybe you get your learner's permit, and when you first get your permit, you go with your parent in the car, but you just stay on surface streets. And then once you get comfortable on surface streets, then maybe you go onto the freeways, but that doesn't happen right away. And then your parent leaves the car when you get your license, and you start on surface streets because you don't feel comfortable, and then you can go on freeways later when you feel comfortable. You get the idea, and you can extend the metaphor from there. But the idea is ultimately that we need to learn how to be comfortable making choices in a given situation. So that is the skill that we are practicing, is learning how to make choices within these different constraints. So when I first start exploring improvisation with students, what I do is I start really, really small. So I'm going to walk you through a beginning exercise that I might do. We're going to do this with a metronome, and we're going to trade back and forth, and this might be how I would do it in a private lesson, but you could also do it like this in a group class or in an orchestra. I'm going to set my metronome to 60. It's just the best tempo. Is there any tempo that's more comfortable than 60? I don't think there is. And we are going to practice playing around with the first three notes of D major. D, E, and F sharp. You can do whatever you want with the first three notes. And normally I might just let a student dive in and just play for an extended period of time. We're going to jump forward, you and I, and we're going to trade. So what I'm going to do is for 8 beats, I'm going to improvise using those 3 beats. When I'm done, I'm just going to play an open D, and you're going to improvise, play around with those 3 notes for 8 beats, and then you're going to go to an open D while I play. We'll go back and forth 2 times. Here we go. I'll go first. 1, 2, ready, and here I go. Your turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. My turn. Your turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so you were playing around with the first 3 notes of D major. Maybe that was easy, maybe that was hard. Whatever happened, that's all good, because especially if you're new to improvisation, this might feel new, and you might be playing stuff and you might think, oh, this is horrible, I hate it. Can't judge it. We just have to let it be, because you haven't experienced making choices yet, and this is a new thing. So now we'll jump ahead. Eventually, I might open it up to a full octave. So we're going to use 1 octave of D major. We're going to do the same thing, where I'm going to play a solo for 8 beats, then you're going to play a solo, I'll play a solo, you play a solo. I'll hold an open D for you while you play. You should do that for me too, so that you can hear what that sounds like. Getting that drone in there helps students to start to hear the function of different pitches within a key signature. What does it feel like to sit on the 7? If you're going from the 7 back to the 1 or to the 8. You don't need to use all the notes in in one octave, by the way. You can use however many of them you want, but now you can use any notes within one octave. Here we go. 8 beats, 1 octave of D major. I'll start. 1, 2, here I go. Your turn. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so maybe you used all of the notes available to you. Maybe you added some syncopations. Maybe you kept it really simple and you didn't even use all the notes. That's all good. We'll take a few more steps ahead so you can see the next place that we're going to go. Now you can play anything in first position in D major. So I love when we get to this point because often students just start scales on the lowest note possible because that's how we play our scales. But these notes are also in D major. So it allows you to sort of get a student thinking about what the whole key feels like rather than always centering the key around whatever the tonic is. So we're going to keep with 8 beats, and you can use any note that you want in first position. And go ahead and play an open D for me while I solo. 1, 2, here I go. Okay, so you probably didn't feel super comfortable getting all around in first position, but that's totally okay because, again, I'm just trying to show you some steps where you could take your students. So how would I use this in a classroom? That's a great question. I would use the same type of format, which is to say that you could stand on the podium and you could say, okay, everyone, I'm going to play X number of beats using whatever the constraint is, and then you all are going to improvise back to me, and you could go back and forth like we just did. The other thing that you could do that is also really helpful is that you can just turn on a metronome over your speaker, or you can just keep time for them and just have them play in whatever those boundaries are. So for example, a common warm-up we use in the Gilbert Fiddlers is just playing in a key. And we'll just put on a metronome and everyone will get a minute to just play in whatever the key signature is. And there's no other restraints. You know, if they want to leave first position, they can leave first position. They can do whatever they want as long as it's in that key signature. So that's how I might use this in a classroom setting, is either just on the podium, going back and forth and trading with the orchestra or the group, or just sort of turning on a metronome or keeping a beat for students and then giving them the constraint. There's some important things to know about how to set this up and how to frame this, though, when you're going to do it. The first thing is that you want all of your students to be improvising at the same time. And it's going to sound like chaos, but in chaos, there is safety because no one else will hear you when you're improvising. So you never, ever want to just put a student on the spot and make them improvise something in front of their peers. Unless that's like part of the curriculum and you're like running a jazz band and that needs to happen. But if you're just exploring this as a tool, that's like the fastest way to kill someone's potential enthusiasm for exploring improvisation. So whenever you think about introducing improvisation exercises, especially if they're for groups and especially if those students are new to it, you always want to build safety into the exercises. And the easiest way to do that is to make sure that there's lots happening so that no one is heard, because eventually they'll feel comfortable doing stuff while everyone else around them is doing stuff at the same time. And you want them to build that comfort. So that's an important thing, is to have your students improvise at the same time. It will sound like chaos, but there's safety in chaos. The other thing, and I did this for you as we were going, is that when you demonstrate, or if you're trading with a solo, if you're demonstrating things that could be done, you should always demonstrate easy things. So that if, for example, you have opened it up and your students can play any note in first position, the students who are not comfortable yet exploring that key on whatever string, they need to feel comfortable not going there. So you can remind them, you don't need to use all the notes in first position, but you can play any of them. And then if they just want to hang out on two strings, they want to hang out on two strings. So whenever you're giving these constraints, especially if they're broader, you need to understand that students are going to work within those at whatever level is comfortable for them. In the same way, going back to our metaphor earlier, some kids are probably really comfortable going over to their neighbors' houses, and some kids probably aren't comfortable going over to the neighbors' houses. So you need to understand that the outcome will look different for everyone, but you want to move those constraints really slowly and in a comfortable way so that people can build their comfort making choices within this construct. The end results of this process are that your students learn what it feels like and what it sounds like to play in a key signature. Remember that this idea of like scales and music and how they often feel separate for students. One of the reasons for that is because scales don't ever really feel like music making. They don't mimic how we actually play music. This does, because it's getting your students to move around the instrument. They're thinking in varied rhythms. They're adding slurs. That's what music feels like. So it gets them comfortable thinking about being in a key signature and playing in a key signature. It really, really builds their ears and their awareness of the fingerboard. But the other thing is that it builds an active awareness for them of their own boundaries and their own comfort level. So you want to instruct students to be working at the edge of their ability. So if you can play faster rhythms, use faster rhythms. If you can play on all four strings, use all four strings. So when you're working at the edge of your own ability and your own comfort, it's super, super, super engaging because you're constantly problem solving. And improvisation is the act of making choices. It's just problem solving. So you're getting your students to engage with playing an instrument in a way that very much is based on solving problems. How do I play anything I want to in first position in the key of D major? So this is soloing in a key, improvising in a key. Again, this is a huge concept, but you can take this concept and you can boil it down into really, really small bits, and you're exploring, adjusting those constraints so your students can get more freedom as they go. The second exercise that we're going to explore is what I call echoes. At its very basic level, echoing is just a structured way of working on ear training. I play something, you play it back to me. I play something, you play it back to me. But you can easily incorporate improvisation into this format. So what I might do with a classroom is, of course, I'm going to start this echoing construct just as purely echoing with no improvisation. So I would be the only person improvising. Let me give you an example. I'm going to start at 60 again. We're just going to stay in D major for ease. And I am going to improvise 4 beats of notes using the first 5 pitches of D major. And then I want you to play it back to me right away in time. I'll leave the metronome going. And then I'll do another one, and then you'll do it. And we're just going to practice some ear training, echoing back whatever I improvise. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and... Great. Okay, so that's just you echoing what I'm doing. The way that you can incorporate improvisation into this, either in a pair setting or in a group setting, is to have students volunteer to be the ones who are improvising the thing that's going to be echoed back to them. So you could have one student who feels comfortable volunteer to come up onto your podium, and they could, like I just did, they could do 3, 4, 5 phrases and everyone could play them back. You could have groups of students come up and they could go down the line. Each person does one thing. In the Gilbert Fiddlers, when we work on this in rehearsal as a warm-up, that's how we do it. We sit in a circle and we put on a metronome and I'll improvise something for 4 beats and then everyone else will play it back for 4 beats and then we just go down the line. The next person improvises, everyone plays it back. The next person improvises, everyone plays it back. And so it's an ear skill because you're just working on some ear training stuff, but there are ways to incorporate improvisation into it so that whoever is generating the thing that's going to be echoed is doing a very, very safe, tiny little improvisation, just 4 beats in front of their peers. One tip that I would give you that has proven very useful is oftentimes, I shouldn't say oftentimes, occasionally, you might have a student who, for whatever reason, feels the need to do something super complicated in front of everyone when they're generating the thing that needs to be echoed. When that happens, the result is that that student plays something really hard that they likely would not be able to call back if someone else did it. And then when everyone else echoes it back to them, no one is able to play it because it's too hard. And then everyone just kind of feels awkward. And it's not a good situation. So a tip that you should give your students once you start incorporating this exercise with the students themselves creating the material to be echoed is that you should try to create something that you think your peers are going to be able to play back. So if it's my turn to go and I'm like, and I play that, your average orchestra room is not going to be able to get that back on the first try. But if you do things that are really simple, then everyone is building their comfort and their security as you're working through this exercise so that we all feel good while working on echoes. So that is the second exercise that I would introduce. It's called echoes, and it can just be ear training, but then you can incorporate improvisation into it. The third exercise that we're going to explore today is what I call call and response. This is a tried and true improvisational technique. It's the same structure as echoes, except in this situation, instead of just echoing back whatever you heard, you're actually improvising a response to whatever you heard. So it's a way to just incorporate and up the level of general improvisation through this sort of like trading paradigm where one person plays something and then someone else plays something else. Importantly, when you're doing this, the goal is that when you improvise your response, you are trying to match the intent of whatever it is that I have improvised or whoever the student is that's leading this improvisation. So I'll give you a sort of a different example. If I asked you how your day was going and your response was the cat is wearing pajamas, that would not make sense. That is not a logical response to the question, how is your day going? In the same way that if I asked this question and you responded with that's not quite the same thing. That doesn't make sense as a logical response. So if I did that first call, something that might feel like an appropriate response might be like, so when you are explaining this and working on this with your students, that's something that you want to encourage them to do, is to respond appropriately to whatever the call is. So we're going to try this together right now. Once again, metronome at 60. We're going to stay in D major. I'm going to improvise 8 beats worth of material, and then I want you to respond back to that with 8 beats. 1, 2, here I go. 1, 2, 3. Okay, awesome. So on that time I lengthened, we did 8 beats instead of 4. I might start with just doing 4 beats. Again, smaller things are often easier for students to work through, but sometimes it's nice to have a longer space so that you can have a bit more time to explore your own ideas. So that's something to explore in your own implementation of some of these exercises, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to have a bit lengthier of a time to respond. So again, that's call and response. Same structure as echoes. You could have volunteers come up in front of the classroom and they could do multiple things, multiple calls like I just did with you. You could have a row of students volunteer to stand up and do it. This is something you could do in lessons. It's a great way to not only practice making things up in front of people, but also practice improvising in a way that feels a bit more structured because you're thinking about it conversationally. You're thinking about responding to the musical prompt that someone else has given you. The fourth exercise that we're going to explore is called repetitions. This is the most nuanced of the exercises that we're going to be working through, and might also be the most complicated depending on the improvisational comfort and ability level of the students that you're working with. That said, this is something that I've especially used in private lesson contexts with great success, even with younger students, like late elementary, junior high level. So this activity, though, it needs a little bit of setup and explanation. When I was in graduate school, I had a really good friend who was a theater teacher, and she was really into theater pedagogy and studying different ways to help people become actors. She was particularly invested in an acting approach called Meisner technique. What I understand from Meisner technique and how she explained it to me is that it's an approach to acting that is really rooted in sort of mindfulness and awareness and building your ability to notice things visually or to notice feelings or impulses that you might have. So there's a structured series of activities in Meisner technique that you would work through perpetually, and you'd start with the first one, and that's like you just would always be working and building upon the first exercise called repetitions. The way that she explained this exercise is that in a Meisner class you would have 2 students who would volunteer to go stand up in front of the class. And these 2 students would stand facing each other. And what would happen is that they stand there in silence, and then one person says something that they notice or that they feel. So, for example, I could say, I'm feeling a little tired right now. The person standing in front of them would respond by saying, you're feeling a little tired right now. I'm feeling a little tired right now. You're feeling a little tired right now. I'm feeling a little tired right now. You're feeling a little tired right now. And you quickly go back and forth just repeating the thing that the other person said. So if I make an I statement and I say, I'm feeling tired, you would respond with a you statement. You would not say, I'm feeling tired right now. You would say, you're feeling tired right now because you're talking about me. And this goes back and forth, and you're just quickly repeating the thing that the other person is saying. And then at any point, either one of us could change the thing that we were saying if we've noticed something new or something new popped into our awareness. So maybe it would go like this. I'm feeling tired right now. You're feeling tired right now. I'm feeling tired right now. You're feeling tired right now. I'm feeling tired right now and I'd really like to make some coffee. You're feeling tired right now and you'd really like to make some coffee. I'm feeling tired right now and I'd really like to make some coffee. You're feeling tired right now, and it would go on. But you could change it. So if that went back and forth and then you said, I notice you have brown hair, I would say, you notice I have brown hair. I notice you have brown hair. You notice I have brown hair. And we'd go back and forth. Ultimately, what ends up happening is sort of this idea that like anything could happen in a repetition exercise between 2 people, short of the 2 people harming each other physically. So if things got really heated and for whatever reason you were starting to feel sad and you started crying or you started to feel really angry, all of those things are acceptable in that context because what you're trying to do is you're trying to notice emotions either in yourself or in the other person. So as Joanna was explaining this to me, I realized that like, oh, I could probably adapt that for music because the construct is that you're noticing things and making choices and sort of saying them out loud and then responding to them a little bit. So I I practiced this a bunch of different ways and ultimately found a way that I could use this sort of idea with students musically. If we were in person, I would bring a volunteer up and we would do this, but alas, we're not in person. So I asked one of my wonderful private students, Olivia, if she would be willing to demonstrate this exercise with me over a Zoom call. The thing that's important about setting up this exercise with music that I have found is that when I tell a student that they are going to repeat the thing that I'm saying, or when I'm going to repeat that I'm playing, or that I'm going to repeat the thing that they are playing, that the goal is to repeat it exactly as the other person has played it. So if I play something starting at my frog, you, when you play it back to me, when you echo it back, should start at your frog. If I play loud, you should play loud. If I use my whole bow, you should use your whole bow. So that the intent is always to exactly copy. But at any point in time, I can change what I'm doing and I can add on to it. Or the student, in this case Olivia, as you'll see, Olivia can change it. And if she changes it and she comes with something new, then I respond to whatever that is and I repeat it. So we're always repeating the thing that the other person has done, or we're creating something new based on whatever we feel like doing in that moment. So let's watch a little snippet of Olivia and I doing this repetition exercise back and forth. Here we go. We'll do some repetitions. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. It's a little funny to do that exercise over Zoom because there's a bit of a lag. In person, I would play back and forth as quickly as possible with the student so that there's less time to think and more time just focusing on doing whatever the thing is that I have done or in creating something new. Now, in a classroom context, you could do this in a couple different ways. One of the ways that you could do it is you could have a student come up in front of the class, and if you knew that student was going to feel comfortable, you could do this exercise with the student. You could have students break off into pairs and do it with each other. You could have 2 pairs of students come up and do this exercise in front of everyone. You could approach it in a bunch of different ways. But as I was explaining, there's sort of like a comfort level that's necessary. It can be pretty vulnerable to get up in front of a classroom of people with one other person and just do this back and forth while someone else is watching you do it. So there are some ways that you could do it. I have found it to be especially useful in a private lesson context. And in private lessons, the way that I use it is that I use it to get the student to do whatever it is that they're struggling with. So I don't know about you, I often have students who don't feel comfortable like really playing forte. So if I explain this exercise to them and I let them know that the goal is to copy exactly what I'm doing with the same sort of like execution, if that's the goal, usually I can get more sound out of a student because they don't feel like they're the ones making the choice to play loud. They feel like they're copying me. And especially if you have students who are very by the books and want to be doing things right, this is an excellent way to push your students' technique out of their comfort zone. So what I'll do if I have a student who's struggling to play loud is like, maybe I'll do some soft things and I'll play something at the bottom of my bow and then something at the top, and then I'll do some full bows, and then I'll play something really loud. And then because they're already invested in the idea of copying me, they'll play really loud, and then I'll keep playing really loud, and then I'll stop and I'll be like, that sounds wonderful, now play it D. And I'll have them play and pick up wherever they are in their piece, and they're feeling a bit more liberated physically and emotionally because they just played really loudly. So that is often how I use it in a private lesson context. I use it to help a student get to a point that if they're having difficulty getting to it, it's sort of like a roundabout way rooted in improvisation to get students to do something different with their playing. In a classroom context, the other thing that you could do is that same type of thing, if you do it in front of your class, where you're on the podium and it's actually just an echoing exercise. But unlike in echoes, you make the goal to copy you exactly. So if you just use open strings in front of an orchestra and you play a really loud down bow, get your students to play a really loud down bow, and then you can play something at the tip, and then you can play something at the frog. And sometimes I'll even stop and prompt students, and if I do it a couple times and they're not copying me exactly, I'll be like, notice where I'm starting in my bow, and then I'll do the same thing again, and they'll be like, oh, okay, and then they'll adjust. So that is an exercise called repetitions. Again, I have found success using that with students at different ages and different levels, but it requires a certain sort of comfort and awareness to be able to do something like that, because it is responsive, but it's also improvisational, and it could go a lot of different directions. So that is repetitions. So in that last exercise, I told you that I was a little bit tired and I could use a cup of coffee, and I took a break and went and made myself a cup of coffee. Cheers. We have arrived at our fifth and final exercise for this session. This final exercise is an exercise called nonlinear scales. I learned it from my friend and colleague, the incredible Mike Block. Mike is a cellist and a professor at New England Conservatory and the Berklee College of Music. And actually a few years ago, Mike gave a session at ASTA on different ideas for practicing. And this is one of the exercises he described, and it blew my mind, and it has become a regular part of my personal practice routine, but also a regular exercise that I've been having students do. So Mike's notion is that you can practice scales by starting on the tonic and going up and going down, and that is the sort of traditional way of practicing scales, and that gets you all the notes in the key signature. But the other way that you could practice all of the notes in the key signature is to just play them, but in a non-linear fashion. So if you play them randomly and you're just sort of like boop, 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 dipping around, eventually you're going to get to all those notes in the key of D major. So, or I should say, not just D major, whatever key it is that you're practicing in. So let me demonstrate how this works. Trusty metronome. You know I'm going to set it at 60. It's my favorite tempo. The idea, as Mike explained it, is that you start with quarter notes. And every new quarter note is a new pitch in D major. And once I feel comfortable and maybe a little bit bored playing these notes in D major, then I move to eighth notes. Once I'm bored at eighths, I move to triplets. and so forth. So you are always working at the edge of your ability. If you feel bored and very comfortable playing at one rhythmic subdivision, then you move to the next rhythmic subdivision. At any point in time, you can also backstep. So if I move to 16th notes and then I'm like, oh no, get out, this is not safe, then I can move back to triplets. So it works your brain on a lot of different areas, because not only are you processing rhythm and thinking very, very rhythmically with your metronome and thinking through different subdivisions, but you're also starting to figure out, like, really quickly, what does it feel like to play in that key signature? The idea here, especially if you're wanting to get really, really invested in the art of improvisation and you're interested in taking solos, is that you're developing your body's ability to very quickly know what it feels like to play a note in a certain key signature. But from a purely just like instrument awareness standpoint, this is incredible for fingerboard geography, because you start to really know how it feels to play in the keys, even if your goal is never to improvise a solo in front of an audience. So this is something that I actually do in my own personal warm-up whenever I have practice time. I sometimes will play a 3-octave scale, but usually I'll just play through this exercise in whatever the key signature is that I want to be working in, because I find it really compelling. And not only could you do it in first position, but you could do it in second position, or you could do it in third position, or you could do it moving between positions. You could do it with changing rhythms. You could do it with using slurs or not using slurs. Again, you can explore a variety of different types of constraints in this exercise. So the way that I do it in a group context with students is that I just put the metronome on, or I just clap, and everyone does a nonlinear scale, and they're just playing usually in first position with whatever the key signature is that we're doing, and they're moving at the edge of their ability. So what that means is that it also really starts to build your rhythmic independence, because the person next to you in class might be playing eighth notes and you might be playing triplets. Or you might be playing eighth notes and they might be playing triplets. So it sounds chaotic, but remember, in chaos, we can sometimes have comfort. Things can feel solid because no one else can hear you. And the other thing that's really nice about this is that if you land on a note that's not in the key signature, like, no one's gonna know, because it sounds especially chaotic. But that would also be an indication that perhaps you are taking it too fast, and maybe you need to slow down your subdivision. Before we move on from this, to wrap up, I do want to give you a moment to go ahead and practice this. So I'm going to set my metronome here at 60, and I would love for you to practice a nonlinear scale in D major. I'm going to give you about a minute to do this, and I want you to work at the edge of your ability. So start with quarter notes, and once you're like, okay, yeah, this is fine, then move to eighths, and if that feels fine, then move to triplets, and see where you get in 1 minute. Here we go. Whenever you're ready. Okay, we'll go ahead and wrap up. There we go. Nonlinear scales. Okay, we have come to the end of our session exploring improvisational warm-ups. To review, we have gone through 5 different exercises. We started with soloing or improvising in a key, then we went to echoes, call and response, repetitions, and nonlinear scales. Any of these exercises can be used in groups, but I would strongly recommend both for you and your students to develop improvisational comfort and security, to practice soloing in a key and to practice nonlinear scales individually on your own. Those are both incredibly helpful and have helped me so much in my own personal growth as an improviser. A few just general reminders about improvisation. Improvisation is freedom within constraints. It's the act of making choices in the moment. It's really important for us as teachers, especially with advanced students, to separate technical ability from creative ability so that we can understand why sometimes it feels really difficult to improvise things when you can also play a really hard concerto. When you're demonstrating solos in front of students and you're demonstrating ways that they can make choices, especially with small numbers of notes, do keep in mind to demonstrate very, very simple things so that students feel comfortable and secure making simple choices that just have half notes and whole notes and very small numbers of notes. That's an incredibly important thing. But also remember that all of these different exercises are super flexible. So you can use them to accomplish any technical or musical goal you have with your students. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to share this session, is to let folks know that there are other ways. You don't just have to have your students play scales over and over and over again. Because remember, one of the things that we're trying to do as teachers is we're trying to help students make connections between their scales and the music that they play all the time, so that they can see why we practice scales and why this sort of technical study is really, really necessary. And improvisation and improvisation exercises can really help to bridge that gap so that your students can lead more fulfilling, more aware musical lives. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today in this session. You can always feel free to reach out to me, email me with any questions you have. You can get in touch with me through my website, taylormorrismusic.com. I've also included the handout for download on the website in case it's tricky to find it on the conference platform. I wanted to make sure it was available there as well. I really look forward to the day that we can go to conferences again in person. But in the meantime, I hope you have a safe and healthy 2021 and you have fun exploring these improvisational warm-ups and concepts with your students. Thank you for hanging out. Enjoy the rest of your conference.